In the next section of our physiology review, we're going to talk about the two different ways to measure lung volumes using pulmonary function test to help fill out the picture of obstructive and restrictive disease. Welcome back. In the next section of our pulmonary physiology discussion, we're going to talk about lung volumes. This is another form of pulmonary function test. We talked about in the last section spirometry, but the problem with spirometry is we don't ever assess the residual volume, and we can't know what the total lung capacity is. So we have two ways of measuring lung volumes. This is more important to a pulmonary fellow than it will be to a medical student or even a medicine resident. But we can measure either lung volumes by helium dilution, where we measure the helium concentration before and after equilibration with a known volume, or we can do this by what's called a body box or body plasmography. The way this is done is the patient sits in a closed box with a known volume, and it measures the pressure change as they inhale or exhale. There are positives and negatives to each of these techniques, but that's really outside the scope of this course. When we do lung volume testing, we'll see a certain pattern of lung volumes. So for example, we can find out what the total lung capacity, what the residual volume is. In obstructive diseases like asthma or COPD, emphysema, we typically see increased lung volumes. Increased total lung capacity, increased functional residual capacity, or FRC, increased residual volume. And you can see this if you look at a patient with emphysema. A lot of times they'll have a barrel-chested appearance with a widened anterior-posterior AP diameter. This is a result of chronic hyperinflation, chronic large lung volumes. You can also see this sometimes in a patient with an asthma flare. If you look at an x-ray when they come in, their lungs are going to seem hyperinflated. They're going to look larger than a normal lung. When we say larger, you might say more ribs than you would normally see. And this chest x-ray is a good example of somebody with hyperinflation. As you have difficulty getting air out, some air gets trapped behind. That trapped air behind increases your lung volume and lends towards the hyperinflated appearance that you might see on physical exam or on chest x-ray. In restrictive diseases, we see a reduced total lung capacity, typically a reduced residual volume. Forced vital capacity can be normal, but it tends to be reduced. The problem with restrictive lung diseases is that the lungs are functionally smaller. So in this question, we have a 25-year-old that's brought into the emergency department after being exposed to his friend's cat. He's got bad allergies to cats. He's wheezing, he's tachypnic. What would you expect his pulmonary function test to show? Let's go through each of the answers. The first one, we've got a low FEV1 to FVC ratio, and his residual volume is increased. Seems like it might be correct. Let's look at the rest of them, though. In the second question, we see his FEV1 to FVC ratio is decreased, but his residual volume is lower. In patients with obstructive lung diseases, typically all the lung volumes are increased. Residual volume shouldn't be lower. It should actually be higher, so B is incorrect. Answer C, where the FEV1 to FVC ratio is normal, is incorrect, as well as the residual volume being low would be incorrect. Patients whose wheezing tachypnic is having an asthma flare because he was exposed to the cat would be expected to have a low FEV1 to FVC ratio. For that reason, answer D is incorrect as well. The FEV1 to FVC ratio wouldn't be elevated. So the correct answer here is A. Low FEV1 to FVC ratio, high residual volume. Question 2, we've got a patient with triple Wojcicki disease. Mr. S arrives with a diagnosis of triple Wojcicki disease, a rare restrictive pulmonary disease. Which of the following would be expected on his pulmonary function studies? Increased residual volume. Usually we don't see high lung volumes in restrictive diseases. Decreased total lung capacity. We would expect a decreased total lung capacity in somebody like this with restrictive lung disease. So B looks like it's correct. Reduced FEV1 to FVC ratio, answer C. That's incorrect. A reduced FEV1 FVC ratio is seen in obstructive disease, not restrictive disease. So the correct answer here is B, decreased total lung capacity. This is a good example of a question, and one Dr. Thwaites loves, because many times you're going to be going through the boards, going through whatever test you're taking, and you're going to see a disease that you don't remember. Oh, I studied triple Wojcicki disease, but I can't remember what it is. That's common. It's okay. There's a lot to memorize for this, and it's okay if you don't recognize everything. But this question was not testing what triple Wojcicki disease was. This question was testing what pattern we would expect to see in pulmonary function testing in a patient with restrictive disease, of which triple Wojcicki disease is a restrictive disease. There's obviously no such thing as triple Wojcicki disease. But for example, if we replace triple Wojcicki disease with sarcoidosis or with another pulmonary disease that you may not have heard of, if you know that it's restrictive, you can predict what the pulmonary function test pattern will look like for that disease. Don't panic when you're going through questions, whether you see a graph, whether you see an x-ray, whether you see a disease that you don't know. Focus on what you do know. Question 3 is a tough one. While doing the Paso Doble in the new Dancing with the Stars, Vanilla Ice falls from the stage and breaks his spine at level of C6. Oh, too bad. What pulmonary function test parameter would we expect to be increased? This is a pretty tough one. Let's go through each answer. If he broke his spine at the level of C6, we would expect that all the muscles that are innervated from C6 and below are no longer going to work. But C3, 4, 5, where his diaphragm comes from, would work. Answer A is FEV1. Would we expect his FEV1 to be increased? I wouldn't expect his FEV1 to be increased. I would expect, if anything, his FEV1 would be the same. If anything, it might be a little bit low because he couldn't force the air out quite as well. Would we expect his FEV1 to FVC ratio to be increased? No, I don't think B is correct either, because there's nothing that would about the muscle loss that would make his FEV1 to FVC ratio be higher. Would his total lung capacity be increased? No, there's no reason why his total lung capacity would be increased. The correct answer is actually D, residual volume. And the reason his residual volume would be increased is that if he lost muscles below C6, he would lose the innervation of the muscles of his abdominal wall. And those abdominal wall muscles are very important to forced expiration. If he can't force everything out, we're going to see generally a lower forced vital capacity, and we'd also see an elevated residual volume. So that portion, the residual volume relative to his total lung capacity, would be increased. This is a difficult question that even the Hopkins students have trouble with, and it's more important to illustrate some of the points that we're talking about than it's realistic that you would see on USMLEs. Just to review some of the pulmonary function test's main points. Spirometry measures change in volume over change in time. We get an FVC, an FEV1, and an FEV1 to FVC ratio. We can't calculate the static lung volumes. We never know what the residual volume or the total lung capacity is. We can diagnose obstruction on the basis of spirometry, but we can only suggest restriction. Lung volume testing can measure those static lung volumes. We can get a total lung capacity, we can get a residual volume, and it can confirm our diagnosis of restriction. We also see that those are typically low in restrictive diseases and typically high in obstructive diseases. This chart diagrams some of what we just talked about. In obstructive diseases, we see a low FEV1 and a low FEV1 to FVC ratio. In restrictive diseases, the FEV1, the FVC, and the FEV1 to FVC ratio all generally can be normal. The FEV1 and the FVC may be decreased, but they're decreased proportional to each other, so that the FEV1 to FVC ratio is normal. Don't memorize these charts. Think about them in your head. Be able to go through and predict what the answer would be. For lung volume testing, in obstructive disease, we see increased total lung capacity, increased residual volume. Whereas with restrictive disease, we see decreased total lung capacity. That's the hallmark. That's why it's highlighted in red of restrictive disease. Residual volume is decreased as well. Total lung capacity is increased in obstructive diseases, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why as we go on. The problem with obstructive diseases is air can get in, but it can't get out easily. And that's why you get the expanded TLC, the hyperinflation. We can see that hyperinflation on this chest x-ray. We see more ribs than we normally would, and the lungs look bigger than we would expect. Somebody, for example, with asthma may just have the hyperinflation when they have an asthma flare, but might be normal in between. Just to review some stuff from earlier, the bronchial tree distributes air to the lungs. 3 lobes on the right, right upper, right middle, right lower. 2 lobes on the left, just left upper and left lower. There are 4 lung volumes, of which the important ones are tidal volume and residual volume. There are 4 lung capacities. Of those, the important ones that I really want you to remember are total lung capacity, vital capacity, functional residual capacity, or FRC. And pulmonary function tests really can help us to define these lung volumes and to categorize as diseases. Obstructive diseases are defined by a low FEV1 to FVC ratio. How bad they are is determined by what the FEV1 is. It's a disease of exhalation. And typically we see a high FRC, a high residual volume, a high total lung capacity. These are high compliance disease. We'll talk about that later. Restrictive diseases are diagnosed by lung volumes as a reduced total lung capacity and usually reduced residual volume. The spirometry generally is normal. The FRC in these diseases is typically low. These are low compliance diseases generally. Which of the following diagnoses the presence of obstructive lung disease? A reduced FEV1 to FVC ratio. You guys should have this down cold by now. Which of the following quantifies the degree of obstruction? A low FEV, how low the FEV1 is. Answer A. So if you had 2 patients with the same FEV1 to FVC ratio, the patient with the lower FEV1 obviously would be worse off. Which of the following can be seen with restrictive lung diseases? Any of the above. Sometimes the FEV1 or the FVC is normal, sometimes it's reduced. But remember, the FEV1 to FVC ratio would always be normal. Restrictive lung disease is diagnosed by which of the following? Reduced total lung capacity. You guys know this. That concludes the pulmonary function testing portion of this lecture.